Day. I know I'm enjoying the sunshine here in my office. A little bit nicer than the rain yesterday. That should set me up nicely for the weekend, I hope. I've got Lake Coeur d'Alene behind me here. We're going to talk a little bit about what makes boats float today, so hopefully I'll get to do some other experiments this weekend on the lake. Sounds pretty fun. Before we start getting into learning some new things today, you guys get to play your favorite game. We're going to spot the quapple. I'll put 30 seconds on the clock here in just a second, but I want you guys to go through and find that Quest Education logo there, the apple. It's somewhere in that picture with the Coast Guard boat. So 30 seconds on the clock and go. Might have to look around for it a bit. 10 seconds left. Did you find it yet? 3, 2, 1. All right, let's take a look. Did you find it? All right, right up there in the life ring. The guy's tossing out from the side of the boat. Maybe he's trying to save somebody. All right. So have you ever really thought about what makes a boat float? You have these big giant ships that can actually float on the ocean and carry people and food and lifeboats and all this heavy stuff. You would think those boats would sink. What actually makes them float? Well, we're going to talk a little bit today about why certain things float and certain things sink. So let's take an example here first. If I've got a block of metal, a block of steel, let's say, that piece of steel takes up some amount of space. Everything on Earth, including you and I, take up some amount of space. We call that word volume. That's the amount of space that we take up. So if I take a volume of steel and I compare that to the same volume of water, which one do you think weighs more, the steel or the water? Now, water's pretty heavy, but steel is in fact heavier. So chances are most things that are made out of metal are not going to float in water. However, that depends on the shape of that object as well. And that goes for anything besides metal, right? The shape of the object as well as the weight is what's going to determine whether or not it will float. So I'll show you guys an experiment here that you can actually do on your own if you want. But we're going to talk a bit about different shapes and why they would float and why they wouldn't. So all of the science behind this, the principles that make it all work, were discovered by a guy in ancient Greece called Archimedes. And there's a funny story about Archimedes. It goes something like one day he filled his bathtub too full, and when he got in to take a bath, he noticed that a lot of water splashed over the sides, right? If you guys have ever stuck your hand in a bowl of water or anything like that, you notice that if the bowl was too full, some of that water comes out. Well, that's because the weight of whatever you put into that water, it's going to push the water to a different place. We call this displacement of water. And that's what Archimedes discovered. He started thinking about all the science behind this and how things work, and that ultimately led to the discovery of why things float and why they don't. And you can look up more information on this, but really what it comes down to is if you place an object that weighs a certain amount in water, it's going to displace that same weight in water, right? So maybe another experiment you guys could think of if you wanted to test out placing a known weight of an object in water, figure out whether or not it's going to match up to the weight of displaced water. It should. Now, the displaced water has a lot to do with why things float, but there's also a little bit more to the story too. It has to do with the area in which we're distributing that weight across the water. So if you think about different shapes that you've maybe put in your bathtub before, for example, some things that are bigger and smaller may have different behaviors in terms of whether they float or not. So if you think about a boat or the hull of a ship, that long shape that is placed in the water, there's a lot of area for the water to push up against with force. When we talk about displacing water, really what the water is doing is forcing up upon the object. If there's enough area to actually place force onto, it's going to cause that item to float in water, right? So here's the experiment you guys can do with me. I happened to do this one yesterday. You can take an ordinary piece of aluminum foil from your kitchen, and we're going to create a new shape out of it. So I wanted to make a boat. My boat doesn't look very good, but I tried to make a little canoe shape out of it. So we've got a long area underneath the boat. Hopefully will float when I place it in water. Let's find out whether or not that actually worked. So before I did this, I also made sure that I weighed the amount of aluminum foil that I used to create that boat. Okay, this will be important later on. You guys don't have to weigh your objects, but it's basically just to prove whether or not this is actually working. You'll notice here when I placed my canoe in a bowl of water, it does in fact float. Now if I take that same piece of aluminum foil without doing anything else to it, I just crumple it up into the smallest ball that I could make. I weighed it again to show you guys that I didn't add any additional weight to it. It's the same amount of material, but we changed the shape of it. Now because there's less area for the water to push against, I think you guys can already imagine what's going to happen. Will this thing float or will it not? Let's find out for sure. Take the same shape, we drop it in the water. It doesn't float this time, right? So there's a really easy experiment you guys can do to experiment with a property called buoyancy. Why things float and why they don't. If an item is buoyant, it'll flow on top of the water. If it's not buoyant, it's going to sink. So hopefully that was a fun experiment for you guys, and I hope you guys are really enjoying all the stuff we're putting out here on QuestBite. A lot of fun experiments for you guys to try out on your own. Speaking of which, tomorrow Corinne will be back to revisit the Diet Coke and Mentos experiment. You guys saw the backyard explosion that she created with the bottle of Diet Coke. We're going to revisit this with a twist. If you tune in tomorrow, you'll see how 3D printing can make this a little bit more interesting. Hope you guys enjoyed the session today. Feel free to tune in and learn some more tomorrow. Hope you guys enjoy it. And make sure to continue your quest for knowledge. We'll see you guys next time.